The obstetrician asked one simple question that shredded my 9-year marriage like silk. "How is your daughter doing?" I stood completely paralyzed. For 9 years, I believed I gave birth to a son. If she was right, who was the boy sleeping under my roof? And who stole my real child? I do not weep in hospital hallways. I smile, gather the evidence, and force an entire dynasty to crush their own masks in public. I am Athena Galloway, and I do not deal in emotions. I deal in risk mitigation and corporate law. From my corner office on the 42nd floor, the slate-gray waters of Elliott Bay usually offer a sense of control. Today, however, the ringing of my private line shattered that control. It was the headmaster at Briar Ridge Academy. My 9-year-old son, Lucas Dane, was suspended. He had not just broken a rule, he had deliberately taken a hammer to the autonomous marine vessel model built by a scholarship student during the regional engineering qualifiers. I made the drive to the academy in 20 minutes. When I walked into the headmaster's office, I expected to see a child shrinking under the weight of his actions. Instead, Lucas sat in the leather chair, one ankle crossed over his knee, looking profoundly bored. A bloody paper towel was wrapped carelessly around his right hand. "He got into a scuffle after the incident," the headmaster explained, his voice trembling slightly under my gaze. "The other boy pushed him." Lucas grazed his hand on the scattered pieces of the project. I looked at my son. "Why did you ruin his project, Lucas?" He didn't so much as blink. He looked back at me with eyes that mirrored my husband's, delivering a line that sounded exactly like something rehearsed in his grandmother's parlor. "Kids not in our league should not be on the same playing field." The sheer arrogance of a 9-year-old boy, stating that with absolute conviction, made my jaw tighten. I did not raise my voice. I grabbed his jacket. "We are leaving. You need stitches." St. Cressida Medical Center smelled of iodine and industrial bleach. It was the same hospital where I had been rushed in an ambulance almost exactly 9 years ago. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of gurneys and shouting nurses, but the VIP wing was as silent as a tomb. I left Lucas in examination room 4 with a resident physician and stepped out into the pristine white hallway to breathe. That was when I saw her. "Doctor?" Helena Voss had aged, her hair now entirely silver, but her posture was as rigid and unyielding as a steel rod. She was the chief of obstetrics, the woman whose hands had pulled my child from my body during a sudden, catastrophic placental abruption that nearly bled me out on the operating table. She paused, her sharp eyes scanning my face. "Athena Galloway," she said, her voice warm but clinical. "It has been quite a while. You look well. Considering the last time I saw you, you were barely clinging to your vitals." "Dr. Voss," I nodded, offering a tight, polite smile. "Thank you. I'm doing very well." She smiled back, adjusting her clipboard. Then, she asked the question that would systematically dismantle my entire existence. "How is your daughter doing?" The air in the corridor seemed to evaporate. I stared at her, my brain instantly trying to correct what I assumed was a simple administrative error in her memory. "You are mistaken, doctor," I said, my tone smooth and practiced. "I had a son. Lucas is in the exam room right now getting a cut stitched up." "Doctor." Voss stopped smiling. The polite, conversational ease vanished from her face, replaced by the acute certainty of a medical professional who trusts her own hands above all else. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing deeply. "Athena, I have delivered thousands of infants in my career, but I do not forget an emergency crash cesarean where I almost lost the mother. You were under general anesthesia because the spinal block failed. It was chaotic. But I remember the moment clearly. I pulled a premature baby girl from your uterus." I felt a cold prickle start at the base of my neck. "Doctor, you must have confused my chart with another patient." "No," she insisted, her voice dropping to a low, firm whisper. "She was tiny, barely breathing at first, and she had a very distinct birthmark. A small crescent moon shape right on the back of her left shoulder. I noted it in my operative report before I handed her off to the neonatal intensive care team." My vision narrowed. A crescent moon birthmark. A girl. I tried to swallow, but my throat was painfully dry. 9 years ago. I woke up in the recovery ward groggy, heavily medicated, and tethered to a dozen machines. The first face I saw was my husband, Everett Dane. He was holding a bundle wrapped in a blue receiving blanket. He leaned down, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "We have a beautiful, strong boy. Athena." I had never questioned it. Why would a mother question the child placed in her arms by her own husband? "Excuse me, Dr. Voss," I managed to say, my voice suddenly sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "I need to check on my son." I walked away before she could say another word. I did not go back into examination room 4. Instead, I rested against the cool plaster wall in the corridor, took out my phone, and sent Everett a quick message. "I'm at Street, Cressida. Lucas hurt his hand at school. I just ran into Dr. Helena Voss in the hallway. She told me I gave birth to a girl." I hit send. In my world of corporate litigation, when you drop a bombshell piece of information, you measure the time it takes for the opposition to react. The silence is often more damning than the response. My phone rang less than 10 seconds later. "Athena." Everett's voice came through the speaker. It was smooth, rich, and entirely devoid of panic. It was the voice he used when closing a hostile takeover. "What is this nonsense you're texting me?" "Helena Voss stopped me in the hallway," I replied, keeping my own voice dead level. "She said she delivered a girl. She described a birthmark on the left shoulder." Everett let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. It was a perfectly executed sound of mild amusement. "Darling, the woman is well past her prime. She probably has early-onset dementia. You know how these old doctors get. They mix up charts. They mix up years. You were unconscious. I was there. I saw Lucas being born. Do not let a senile woman upset you over nothing." He was speaking too quickly. The cadence of his words was flawlessly structured, leaving no room for hesitation. He was mitigating a risk. She seemed very certain. "Everett, Helena Voss always misremembers people," he said, the amusement vanishing, replaced by a sudden chilling finality. "Get Lucas stitched up and bring him home. We will discuss his suspension tonight." He ended the call. The dial tone hissed in my ear. I lowered the phone and slowly turned my head to look through the narrow glass window of the examination room door. Lucas was sitting on the examination table. The resident doctor was preparing a local anesthetic syringe. Lucas was not looking at the doctor. He was looking at his smartphone, his uninjured thumb flying across the screen. He was texting. A smirk played on his lips, a cruel, entitled little smirk that I had seen on Everett's face 1,000 times, and on his mother, Lenora Dane's face 1,000,000 times more. He looked so incredibly comfortable in his arrogance. I stared at the boy sitting on that table. He had my last name. He lived in the mansion I paid for. He was being groomed to inherit shares in Galloway Marine Systems. But looking at the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the absolute absence of my own reflection in his features, a terrifying clarity washed over me. I am an analyst. I look at ledgers, I find the discrepancies, and I ruthlessly follow the money. My marriage had never been a partnership of love. It had been a merger. And right now, all the data points were suddenly converging into one horrifying conclusion. I was not standing in the middle of a troubled marriage. I was standing in the middle of a massive, meticulously orchestrated fraud. A 9-year-old lie wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. I did not collapse. I did not slide down the wall and weep into my hands. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and took a deep, steadying breath. If they had stolen my flesh and blood to secure their power, I would not just take her back. I would tear their entire empire down to the studs, and I would make them hand me the hammer. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. The house was completely silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only exists in mansions bought with corporate blood and maintained by a small army of staff. I sat alone in the mahogany-paneled library, the heavy oak doors locked from the inside. Spread across the massive leather-topped desk were 3 banker boxes of my personal archives. I was not a mother looking for memories. I was a forensic auditor dissecting a failing enterprise. I pulled out the manila folder labeled with the year of the pregnancy. I opened it and spread the medical records under the harsh glare of the brass reading lamp. I started with the anatomy scans. The sonographer report from week 20 was clear. The black ink stark against the white paper. Fetal sex, female. I pulled the report from week 28. The private obstetrician had noted the exact same thing: normal development, female fetus. There was not a single line of ambiguity, not a single percentage of doubt. My hands moved methodically, but a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. For 9 years, my mind had accepted a rewritten history. The trauma of the placental abruption, the massive blood loss, the days lost to powerful narcotics in the intensive care unit, all of it had created a blank canvas, and Everett had painted his own masterpiece over my missing days. I reached into the bottom of the box and retrieved a small, burgundy leather planner from that year. I flipped through the stiff pages until I reached the week of the emergency admission. There, in the corner of a Tuesday block, written in my own sharp, slanted handwriting, was a single sentence. If it is a girl, maybe name her Willa. A visceral chill ran down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. I stared at the ink. I had absolutely no memory of writing that name. None. The psychological manipulation required to erase a mother's instinct and replace her reality was staggering. It was not just a lie. It was a total mental overwrite. I set the planner aside and picked up the hospital discharge summary. This was the final piece of the medical puzzle. I ran my finger down the printed lines. Something was fundamentally wrong with the formatting. It lacked the standard, messy ink signature that usually graced the bottom of boss's reports. Instead, there was a vague, digitized stamp of approval from a completely different physician, an on-call doctor from a later shift. Furthermore, the print date at the very top of the page indicated the file had been generated and printed 48 hours after my surgery, right around the time I first regained full consciousness. The original file, the one Dr. Voss would have signed immediately after the procedure noting a female birth, was gone, erased and replaced. The question was no longer what had happened, but why. I left the desk and walked to the far corner of the library, where a heavy oil painting concealed Everett's private wall safe. He thought I did not know the combination. He forgot that I am the one who calculates the risk algorithms for our home security system. I dialed in his mother's birth date, a pathetic, predictable choice, and pulled the heavy steel door open. I bypassed his offshore account ledgers and luxury watch certificates. I was looking for leverage, and I found it in a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of the legal firm that managed the Galloway Maternal Family Trust. I pulled out the heavy parchment documents. It was an excerpt from the Blue Current Foundation bylaws, a charitable trust established by my late grandfather. He was a brilliant man, but tragically traditional. My eyes scanned the archaic legal jargon until they locked onto a specific, highlighted clause. It stated, with absolute ironclad clarity, that the firstborn son of Athena Galloway would automatically inherit a proxy voting seat on the foundation board the moment that child reached the age of 10. I closed my eyes. The Blue Current Foundation held a crucial block of equity, an additional 12% of voting rights in Galloway Marine Systems. In the cutthroat arithmetic of our board of directors, 12% was the difference between holding the throne and being ousted. The horrifying, brilliant motive crystallized in my mind. A baby boy was not a blessing to Everett and his mother. Lenora, a baby boy was a hostile takeover. He was the golden key to stripping my absolute control over the company my father built. And Lucas, the boy sleeping upstairs, was currently 9 years old. He would turn 10 in less than 12 months. The timeline was closing. I did not put the papers back. I laid them on the desk, picked up my encrypted phone, and dialed a number I had not used in 3 years. Malcolm Sayer answered on the second ring. He was a veteran private investigator, a former intelligence officer who moved through Seattle's elite circles like a ghost, specializing in corporate espionage and high net worth divorces. Athena. His gravelly voice came through the speaker. It is late even for you. I have a contract. Malcolm? I said, my voice perfectly level. Top-tier billing. Complete discretion. Give me the parameters. I need a total forensic reconstruction of a specific date 9 years ago. I instructed. I want the security camera logs from the street, Cressida Medical Center parking structures. I want the digital footprint of the maternity ward, visitor registries. I need you to flag any unusual wire transfers, offshore movements, or cash liquidations originating from the Dane family office around that time. And I want a microscope put on my mother-in-law, Lenora Dane. Find out who she spoke to, who she paid, and where she was during those 48 hours. That is a deep dive into an old well, Malcolm noted dryly. What exactly are we looking for? A missing asset, I replied, cold and flat. And the architects of its disappearance. Consider it done. The following evening, I was sitting in the same chair in the library when the secure notification pinged on my laptop. It was an encrypted file transfer from Malcolm. I opened it. There was no long report, just a series of flagged hospital admission records and a brief, blunt message. Look at the sister. I opened the attached PDF. It was an intake log. For the Saint. Cressida Phi IP Maternity Wing. My name was there. Logged in for an emergency crash cesarean. I scrolled down exactly 3 lines. There it was. Camille Rourke, Everett's younger sister. The data hit me like a physical blow. Camille had been admitted to the exact same ward, on the exact same night, just 4 hours after my surgery began. I vividly remembered Camille's situation back then. She was fresh off a catastrophic real estate investment, drowning in debt, and heavily pregnant with a child whose father had vanished. She was desperate, bankrupt, and entirely dependent on Lenora's financial mercy. I stared at the 2 names on the screen, Athena Galloway, Camille Rourke, 2 women, 2 deliveries, one desperate for money, the other unconscious and bleeding out. The emotional dam inside me threatened to crack. The image of a tiny baby girl with a crescent moon birthmark being carried away, traded like a commodity in a corporate merger, clawed at my chest. The betrayal was so profound, so intimately violent, that it demanded screams. It demanded that I tear through the house and confront Everett right then and there. But I am Athena Galloway. I do not scream. I win. I close the laptop screen. I reach for my heavy black fountain pen and open my leather-bound notebook. I did not allow a single tear to fall onto the crisp, white paper. The time for grief would come later, when the architects of this nightmare were completely ruined. I pressed the nib to the paper and wrote one single, undeniable line. If there were 2 births, there are 2 children, and a lie will always leave a receipt. The dossier Malcolm Sayer slid across the stainless steel table of the empty Marina warehouse was thick enough to contain a small corporate merger. We were meeting an hour past midnight. The only sound the rhythmic slapping of dark water against the concrete pylons outside. I did not open the file immediately. I watched Malcolm. His face was a map of cynical lines, illuminated by the harsh overhead bulb. You told me to look for a missing asset, Malcolm said, his voice a low gravel scrape in the cavernous room. I found a hostile takeover of your bloodline. You were expecting a mistress, a cheap hotel room, a hidden credit card statement. Your husband is far too calculating for something as common as lust. Everett did not cheat on you with a woman. He and his mother colluded to commit a multi-generational fraud. I placed my hands flat on the cold metal table. Give me the structure of the syndicate. It is a tight circle, Malcolm explained, tapping the heavy manila folder. 5 distinct players, your husband Everett, your mother-in-law Lenora, Everett's sister Camille, floor nurse named Marla Pike, and the architect who built the legal fortress around the entire operation, your family trust attorney, Baxter Wynne. Hearing Baxter Wynne's name elicited a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. He had sat at my dining table. He had poured my wine. He had drafted the very corporate bylaws that were now being weaponized against me. Malcolm opened the dossier and spread out a series of financial flowcharts and heavily redacted medical logs. Let us talk about motive and supply. 9 years ago, Camille Rourke was bleeding out financially. She had leveraged her entire trust fund on a commercial real estate development in Bellevue that went totally bankrupt. She was $3 million in the red, facing criminal negligence charges from her investors. She was also 9 months pregnant by a venture capitalist who fled the country the moment the subpoenas dropped. She had a healthy baby boy, but zero capital to raise him in the manner the Dane family requires. The icy logic of their plan began to freeze the air in my lungs. I looked at the photograph of Camille attached to a financial ruin report. She looked terrified. Lenora Dane did not do charity, not even for her own daughter. Lenora did transactions. They did not harm anyone physically, Malcolm continued, pointing a thick finger at a copy of a hospital database code. They are too sanitized for violence. What they did was perform a cold redistribution of human assets. A swap executed purely on paper. Marla Pike altered the raw data in the Cressida mainframe. Your file was digitally scrubbed of the female designation and replaced with male. Camille's file was intentionally corrupted, leaving the infant's sex ambiguous and paving the way for a rapid, closed internal guardianship transfer drafted by Baxter Wynne. I stared at the black ink on the white pages. They had taken my child and pushed her entirely out of the Galloway registry. They had slotted a boy into my house to secure the voting proxy, while erasing my daughter from existence to prevent any future claims to my estate. It was not a kidnapping in their eyes. It was tax evasion applied to human lives. Where is the money going now? I asked, my voice devoid of any tremor. The Dane family office runs a highly obfuscated shell corporation out of Delaware, Malcolm replied. I traced a recurring monthly wire transfer, $5,000, distributed on the first of every month for the past 108 months. The recipient is a woman named Ruth Quinn. She is a 55-year-old retired elementary school teacher living in a coastal town called Port Townsend, Washington. Malcolm slid a blurry photograph across the table. It showed a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, carrying a canvas grocery bag. I accessed a sealed, heavily encrypted annex in Baxter Wynne's server. Malcolm said, according to his internal ledger, Ruth Quinn believes she is providing a confidential, off-the-grid guardianship for a child of a high-net-worth individual. The cover story fed to her was that the child needed absolute protection from vicious media exposure and a violent custody dispute. They weaponized a good woman's morality to hide their stolen goods. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, committing Ruth Quinn's name to the deepest vault in my mind. Then I looked back at Malcolm. And Lucas? That is the ugliest part, Malcolm said softly. I pulled the black box data from the family SUV and the private dining room security feeds from the Rainier Club. Lucas has been having secret bi-weekly lunches with Everett and Lenora for the last 3 years. You were always told he was at fencing practice or private tutoring. Malcolm handed me a small tablet. I pressed play. The video was silent, black and white footage from the corner of an exclusive dining room. I watched my mother-in-law, Lenora, leaning across the table. She was holding Lucas's hands. She looked at him with a terrifying, predatory devotion. The audio transcript Malcolm had extracted via lip-reading software was printed below the video frame. Lenora's words were clear. You are our little heir. You carry the entire weight of this family. Everything belongs to you. I shoved the tablet back to Malcolm. The nausea was finally hitting me, not from grief, but from the absolute toxicity of the environment my supposed son was breathing. The next afternoon, the reality of that toxicity manifested perfectly. I was standing in the hallway outside Lucas's bedroom. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. He was supposed to be writing an apology letter to the school board for destroying his classmate's project. Instead, he was on a video call, his voice echoing loudly against the hardwood floors. I do not care if they expel me, Lucas sneered to whoever was on the other end of the screen. My dad said the school needs our endowment more than they need a science fair. I was born to have shares, while other people just come to beg for scholarships. I own the board. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the corridor. The sheer arrogance radiating from a 9-year-old boy was suffocating. I realized then that Lucas's cruelty did not just sprout from thin air. He was not born a monster. He had been meticulously sculpted into one by Everett and Lenora. They had fed him a false mythology of supreme entitlement from the moment he could walk. They had ruined his character to ensure he would be a ruthless proxy for their greed. I walked away from the door without making a sound. I went down to the grand foyer, picked up my keys, and walked out into the cold Seattle drizzle. I sat behind the steering wheel of my car and pulled a slip of paper from my coat pocket. Malcolm had written down a single address. A small house on a street facing the water in Port Townsend. Vengeance is a dish best served with absolute structural precision. I knew exactly how I could obliterate Everett, Lenora, and Baxter Wynne. I could freeze their assets, lock them out of the boardrooms, and watch them drown in federal indictments. But looking at the address on the paper, the corporate strategist in me went completely silent, violently overthrown by something primal and undeniable. I started the engine. Destroying my husband was the secondary objective. The primary objective was waiting 100 miles away, growing up under a false narrative, completely unaware that she belonged to me. I put the car in gear and drove toward the ferry terminal. I was going to find the little girl who was meant to live in my house. The drive to the Olympic Peninsula took just under 3 hours, tracing a winding highway choked with dense evergreens and heavy, low-hanging clouds. The air in Port Townsend was entirely different from the sterile, filtered oxygen of my corner office in Seattle. It tasted of raw ocean salt, rusted iron, and wet cedar sawdust. I parked my car near the Point Hudson Marina under the official pretense of a corporate audit. Galloway Marine Systems had funded a community wooden boat restoration program here for years, a minor philanthropic tax deduction I had historically approved without a second glance. Today, that paperwork was my armor. I walked past the weathered iron gates of the cooperative workshop. The sharp tang of marine varnish and the loud, rhythmic grinding of orbital sanders filled the damp afternoon air. Inside the cavernous, open-air shed, a half-finished wooden skiff rested on heavy structural cradles. A group of young children wearing oversized, bright orange life jackets were struggling to secure a heavy canvas tarp over a stack of milled lumber. Their small hands were failing miserably against the thick, stiff nylon ropes, the wind threatening to tear the fabric away. Then, a girl stepped out from behind the stern of the skiff. She was 9 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, purely utilitarian braid, and her eyes were a piercing, stormy gray-blue. She did not yell to get the children's attention, nor did she push them aside with the aggressive impatience common in kids her age. She simply stepped into the center of the chaos, gently moved a smaller boy's hands away from the tangled line, and secured a perfect, tensioned bowline knot with an efficiency that was startling to witness. "You have to tension it from the base, not the tail," she instructed the younger boy, her voice calm, flat, and remarkably authoritative. I stopped walking entirely. My chest tightened so violently that I had to press my fingernails deep into the leather of my handbag. That was Willa. She climbed up the side of the wooden scaffolding with easy agility to inspect the mounting bracket of a salvaged outboard engine. As she reached high above her head to check the heavy brass alignment, the oversized collar of her faded flannel shirt slipped off her left shoulder. There it was, exactly where I had been told it would be. A small, distinct birthmark shaped perfectly like a crescent moon, resting dark against her pale skin. All the oxygen left my lungs in one jagged, painful exhale. I had to reach out and grip the edge of a cold metal workbench just to keep my knees from buckling beneath me. The data, the hospital logs, the encrypted files. They were no longer just ink and pixels on a screen. The truth was breathing, moving, and existing right in front of my eyes. "Can I help you find someone?" I turned sharply to see a woman wiping heavy black grease from her hands with a shop rag. It was Ruth Quinn. She wore a heavy canvas jacket and had the calloused, scarred hands of a lifelong laborer. She possessed the steady, uncompromising gaze of a working-class woman who had long ago learned how to maintain her absolute dignity when standing in front of wealthy people. I introduced myself smoothly, projecting the polished persona of a corporate philanthropy representative here to review the grant utilization and assess the workshop's future needs. Ruth nodded, offering a polite but carefully guarded welcome. She led me to a small desk covered in blueprints. As she walked me through the workshop ledger, her eyes kept drifting protectively back to Willa. "She is a natural with her hands," Ruth said softly, watching the girl diagram a pulley system on a scrap piece of cardboard. "Willa is not like most kids her age. She has absolutely zero interest in dolls or pleasing adults. She loves heavy machinery, the ocean, and reading complex tide charts, and she absolutely despises being pitied or babied by anyone." I watched Willa erase a pencil line on her cardboard. She tilted her head slightly to the left, squinting sharply at the faulty angle of her drawing. A moment later, she bit down hard on her lower lip while mentally calculating the mechanical correction. A phantom ache radiated deep through my ribs. I tilted my head exactly like that when a contract discrepancy annoyed me. I bit my lower lip the exact same way when reviewing a hostile legal deposition. It was haunting. To look at a child I had never once raised, never once held, and see my own fiercely guarded, analytical mannerisms staring right back at me was a profoundly disorienting experience. A local fisherman walked past the scaffolding and patted Willa on the head, offering a wide smile. "You are such a sweet little helper today," he said brightly. Willa immediately stiffened. She took a deliberate step back, physically rejecting the patronizing affection. "I am not helping, Mr. Miller," she stated flatly, looking him dead in the eye. "I am recalibrating the starboard winch." I did not reveal my identity that afternoon. Dropping an emotional, life-shattering bomb onto a 9-year-old girl who clearly valued logic, space, and order would have been reckless. Instead, I returned to the Port Townsend boatyard 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. I brought architectural blueprints of historical schooners, advanced maritime engineering textbooks, and a set of professional-grade brass drafting calipers, presenting them as an expansion of our corporate educational program. I maintained a strict distance. I would sit on a wooden crate near the office while Willa worked, letting her approach the materials entirely on her own terms. Slowly, the thick defensive wall she kept around strangers began to lower, just enough for her to approach me and ask quiet, highly technical questions about hull displacement and buoyancy physics. On my 4th visit, Ruth and I were sitting in the small, drafty office overlooking the boatyard. I was reviewing a stack of supply invoices when Ruth poured me a cup of black coffee. She looked incredibly tired, the lines around her eyes deeper and darker than they had been on my first visit. "I really appreciate the new drafting tools you brought for her," Ruth said, her voice dropping a fraction as she looked out the window. "Things have been quite a bit tighter around here lately." "Did the community board cut your municipal funding?" I asked casually, keeping my eyes fixed on the paperwork in front of me. Ruth sighed, rubbing the back of her neck with a calloused hand. "No, it is not the municipal board. It is a private matter. I had a confidential arrangement for Willa. A private trust that provided a monthly stipend to ensure she was taken care of safely and quietly. The money came on the 1st of the month, every single month, for her entire life." She paused, her jaw tightening. "But they cut it off abruptly 6 months ago. The entity representing the trust sent a very brief, cold letter. They said the child no longer needed to be kept quiet." 6 months ago. I kept my face perfectly still, but a blinding rage ignited in my chest. 6 months ago was exactly when the final legal steps had been initiated back in Seattle to secure the upcoming proxy seat on the foundation board. They had secured their victory on paper, so they simply discarded the financial leash keeping Willa hidden in this coastal town. She was no longer a threat to their timeline. She was just deleted overhead. I stood up, thanked Ruth for the coffee, and walked out to my car. As I started the engine, I looked through the windshield at the boatyard one last time. Willa was standing on the edge of the wooden dock. the cold wind whipping her dark hair around her face, staring out at the gray, churning expanse of the water. I put the car in gear and drove away with the cruelest realization settling heavily into my bones. My daughter had not been ruined or broken, but her entire childhood, every breath she had taken by the sea, had been purposefully orchestrated, funded, and managed by my own family, all to ensure she would never once bear her mother's name. I returned to Port Townsend on a Tuesday morning, the coastal air biting through my wool coat. I did not go to the boatyard. Instead, I drove directly to the small, weathered house facing the inlet. I asked Ruth Quinn to sit with me at her kitchen table. I did not offer pleasantries. I laid out the architecture of the deception with clinical precision. I recounted the obstetrician's memory of the birthmark, the digitally altered medical charts, the identity swap in the hospital ward, and the uninterrupted chain of payments flowing from the Dane family accounts directly to her local bank. Ruth sat frozen, the color draining entirely from her face. Her rough, calloused hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the scarred wood of the table. She did not defend herself. She confessed, her voice thick with horror, that 9 years ago, she truly believed she was providing sanctuary. Baxter Wynne had painted a terrifying picture of a vicious, high-profile custody war. He told her she was sheltering an innocent child from a ruthless father who intended to use the baby as a pawn in a dirty asset dispute. She had lived the last 9 years believing she was a guardian against corporate evil. She had absolutely no idea she was the warden keeping a stolen daughter away from her biological mother. With Ruth's devastated consent, we initiated a closed, highly secure legal process. I arranged for a private genetic swab 2 days later, bringing a trusted medical proxy to the house under the guise of an advanced health screening. The results arrived 72 hours after that. The probability of maternity was 99.9%. The sterile laboratory paper merely confirmed the undeniable truth my instincts had already screamed at me on the docks. Willa was my flesh and blood. After reading the results, Ruth walked slowly into her bedroom and opened the deepest drawer of an old oak dresser. She returned holding a small, faded cedar box. She pushed it across the table toward me. Inside lay the physical artifacts of a stolen life. A tiny plastic hospital wristband that had been cleanly cut, a frayed, pale square cut from a standard-issue hospital receiving blanket, and a thick parchment envelope. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was drafted by Baxter Wynne, his signature sharp and arrogant at the bottom. It explicitly instructed Ruth, under threat of severe legal and financial ruin, to ensure the girl never appeared anywhere near the name Galloway. The instinct of any mother, upon seeing those artifacts, would be to pack a bag, seize her child, and flee. A primal, suffocating urge demanded that I tear Willa away from this modest house and carry her back to Seattle, to the mansion and the life she was owed. But I am a risk analyst. I recognize the destructive nature of collateral damage. Yanking a 9-year-old girl away from the only mother figure she had ever known, dragging her into a war zone of federal indictments and family ruin, would not be a rescue. It would be a second kidnapping. If I acted on pure, selfish emotion, I would be committing a robbery in the name of motherhood. I refused to inflict the same violence on her that Everett had inflicted on me. I asked to speak with Willa alone. We sat in the sunroom at the back of Ruth's house. Through the large glass panes, the gray waters of the bay churned endlessly against the rocky shore. Willa sat opposite me in a faded armchair, her posture rigid, her gray-blue eyes tracking my every movement with calculating intensity. I did not soften my voice. I did not attempt to weave a comforting fairy tale or cast myself as the sole, tragic victim. I spoke to my daughter with the exact same level, respectful cadence I would use with a senior board member facing a crisis. I explained the emergency surgery and my unconscious state. I explained the doctor who remembered a premature girl with a crescent moon mark on her shoulder. I detailed the financial ledgers, the forged documents, and the conclusive DNA test. I told her the unvarnished truth. The adults in my family had treated 2 human lives like tradable commodities to secure their grip on a corporate empire. They had bent both our lives until they broke. I braced myself for the typical reactions of a child. I expected tears, panic, denial, or a desperate attempt to run from the room. Willa did not cry. She sat perfectly still, her jaw set into a hard, unyielding line. She processed the devastating data with a terrifying, familiar efficiency. When she finally spoke, her questions were not born of sorrow, but of surgical logic. "Does that boy know?" Willa asked, her voice sharp and steady, devoid of any tremor. "Lucas knows he is being raised as the heir to the company," I answered truthfully, refusing to lie to her about the boy living in her shadow. "But he likely does not know the full extent of the fraud. He was placed on a stage he did not build." Willa narrowed her eyes, tilting her head slightly. "Did Lenora change the babies just to get shares?" "Yes," I replied. "A clause in our family trust required a male heir to secure long-term voting power. You were an obstacle to their control, so they removed you." She let out a slow, measured breath, turning her head to look out at the dark water. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of a stolen decade. When she looked back at me, her gaze was piercing. "Do you want me to move in with you right now?" "No," I said firmly, holding her gaze. "I will not steal you from Ruth. I am not here to uproot your life or force you into a wealthy world you do not know. I am not here to rip away the only home you recognize. I am here because you deserve the truth. I want you to know, with absolute certainty, that I never voluntarily gave you up." Willa considered my words. I could see the gears turning in her mind, evaluating the risks, weighing the variables. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She was establishing the terms of engagement. "If you are going to be in my life," Willa stated, her tone brokering no argument, "I have rules. I keep my current school. I stay living here with Ruth for now. I will not be put on the news or in the papers. I am not going to be some inspiring story for your rich friends to talk about." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. "And I am not going to call you Mom. Not yet." I looked at the fierce, brilliant, fiercely independent girl sitting across from me. She was not a victim waiting to be saved. She was a survivor setting boundaries to protect her own architecture. I felt a profound, overwhelming surge of pride. "I accept your terms," I said, my voice unwavering. "Every single one of them." I returned to the Seattle mansion as the evening fog rolled off the bay, blanketing the estate in a suffocating gray chill. The sprawling stone house no longer felt like a residence. It was a crime scene, and I was the lead investigator returning to dismantle the primary weapon the suspects had forged. That weapon was currently sitting in the formal dining room, playing a strategy game on a tablet. I walked in, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. I did not yell. I did not project the fury of a betrayed wife. I operated with the icy detachment of a corporate liquidator tearing down a bankrupt subsidiary. I placed a thin, curated manila folder on the polished wood and slid it toward Lucas. "Open it," I commanded quietly. Lucas looked up, his brow furrowed in that familiar, arrogant scowl he had inherited from his grandmother. He tossed the tablet aside and flipped the folder open. I had not given him the complete dossier. There was no need to humiliate a child with the absolute graphic nature of his family's financial desperation. Instead, I provided the verified logistical timeline, the guardianship transfer documents, the internal memos drafted by Baxter Wynne, and the clear, undeniable legal proof that he was not my biological son. He stared at the papers. For a fleeting second, the mask of the untouchable prince slipped, revealing the confused 9-year-old boy underneath. But the conditioning ran deep. He pushed the folder back, his chin jutting out defiantly. "This is fake," Lucas sneered, echoing the exact dismissive tone Everett always used. "Grandmother told me you were going to try to take my place away because you are stressed. I was born to inherit this family. I am the heir." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Inherit what, Lucas, when your very presence in this house is the product of fraud?" The word fraud hit him like a physical strike. He blinked, his breathing hitching. He tried to maintain his defensive posture, but the cracks were forming rapidly. He started to argue, his voice rising in panic, and through the fractured defense, a deeply disturbing truth spilled out onto the table. "It is not fraud," Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. "Aunt Camille is my real mother. I already know that. Grandmother told me a long time ago. She said Aunt Camille was too weak to raise a leader, so it was my duty to come live here. I have a responsibility to protect the family's future." The sheer psychological abuse of that revelation chilled the blood in my veins. They had not just lied to me, they had enlisted a toddler into their conspiracy. They had convinced a child that his abandonment was a noble corporate sacrifice. "And the girl at your school?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "The scholarship student whose project you destroyed. Was that also your duty?" Lucas looked down at his hands. The arrogant fire in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a sullen, defensive shame. "Grandmother said we have to protect our territory," he muttered. "She said people from the outside, people who need scholarships. They only come into our spaces to take what belongs to us. She said if I let them win, they will take my throne." The toxicity was absolute. Lenora Dane had systematically poisoned his perception of the world, turning an innocent boy into a paranoid, ruthless little soldier fighting a phantom war for a prize that did not exist. "There is no throne, Lucas," I said flatly. "And as of this exact second, your reign is entirely over." I stood up and initiated the asset freeze. The deconstruction of his false mythology had to be absolute. I pulled out my phone and systematically canceled his enrollment in the elite junior sailing academy. I withdrew his name from the exclusive Summer Leadership Summit. I then held out my hand and demanded the platinum secondary credit card Everett had secretly opened for him, a card he used to buy loyalty from his classmates. He handed the plastic card over, his hands trembling. He looked entirely lost, a child suddenly stripped of the only armor he had ever known. "Starting this Saturday," I outlined coldly, "you are entering mandatory behavioral therapy with a specialist I have selected. You will spend your weekends performing community labor at the municipal boat repair yard, cleaning fiberglass dust off public vessels. And before you go to sleep tonight, you are going to handwrite a complete, unconditional apology letter to the classmate whose hard work you ruined." He did not argue. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The Cold War escalated the following evening. I was walking past the second-floor study when I heard Lucas's voice through the partially open door. He was on his phone. I stopped in the shadows, listening. Everett was attempting a back-channel insurgency. He was trying to re-establish his grip on the boy's mind. "Do not listen to her, Lucas," Everett's voice drifted through the speaker, tight and desperate. "She is crazy. She is trying to steal your future. You have to stay strong for the family." I waited for Lucas to agree, to fall back into the comfortable lie, but something shifted. Lucas did not respond immediately. On the other end of the line, Everett had clearly forgotten to mute his microphone. The muffled, frantic sounds of a vicious argument bled through the connection. "I told you to shred the secondary ledgers," Lenora's voice shrieked in the background, stripped of all its usual aristocratic polish. "If she audits the Delaware accounts, we are entirely ruined." I did not expect Athena to dig this deep. "I am handling it, Mother," Everett snapped back, his voice raw with panic. "Just keep the board members blind until the gala." I watched Lucas through the crack in the door. He was staring at the phone in his hand, his eyes wide. The grand, invincible pedestal he had placed his father and grandmother on was crumbling into dust before his eyes. He was not miraculously transformed into a perfect child in that instant, but a crucial illusion had been shattered. He finally heard them not as the heroic architects of his destiny, but as terrified, desperate adults scrambling to hide stolen money. Lucas slowly lowered the phone and ended the call. He turned around and saw me standing in the doorway. We stared at each other in the quiet room. He did not look angry anymore. He looked incredibly tired. "What is the gala?" I asked, keeping my tone completely neutral. Lucas swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The loyalty to the Dane family had finally snapped under the weight of their own panic. "The Founders' Tide Gala," Lucas whispered, his voice devoid of any pride. "It is next Friday at the Maritime Museum. Grandmother told my dad they cannot wait for me to turn 10 anymore. She said they have to announce me as the official proxy successor in front of all the foundation donors now, before you can lock them out of the trust." I absorbed the intelligence without blinking. Lenora was accelerating the timeline. She knew I was closing in, so she was attempting a desperate, public crowning ceremony to force the board's hand and legitimize the stolen seat before I could legally freeze the transfer. She wanted an audience to validate her theft. I looked at the boy standing in the center of the lavish room. He was a casualty of their greed, a pawn they were about to push to the center of the board to absorb the final strike. "Thank you for telling me, Lucas," I said quietly. I turned and walked down the grand staircase. The cold, analytical machinery in my mind engaged with absolute, terrifying clarity. Lenora Dane wanted a grand public spectacle to cement her legacy. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to let her build the stage, gather the audience, and stand in the spotlight. And then, I was going to burn the entire theater to the ground. The secure conference room on the top floor of my downtown legal firm transformed into the war room for a corporate execution. Malcolm Sayer stood at the head of the massive frosted glass table. Flanked by my lead private litigator and 2 independent digital forensic experts I had flown in from Palo Alto. We did not rely on emotional appeals. We relied on the undeniable, cold architecture of data. On the massive digital projector, a timeline of the fraud was meticulously constructed. Minute by agonizing minute, we possessed the electronic door swipe logs from the St. Cressida maternity ward, proving the exact second Everett used his high-clearance visitor pass to enter the restricted nursery while I was unconscious. We possessed the server metadata, proving the original medical file was forcefully deleted and reprinted 4 hours after my surgery, effectively scrubbing the female designation from the hospital's mainframe. We tracked the routing numbers from the Dane family office, highlighting the monthly wire transfers crossing state lines to Ruth Quinn, alongside a massive, one-time balloon payment to an offshore account. We had the handwritten extortion instructions from Baxter Wynne, carefully preserved in a plastic evidence sleeve, and sitting in the center of the table, bound in a heavy red folder, was the certified DNA result. The chain of custody was absolute and unbreakable. Malcolm tapped a photograph on the screen. It displayed an older woman, sun-weathered and looking thoroughly defeated, sitting on the porch of a small stucco house in the desert. "Marla Pike," Malcolm announced, his voice echoing against the glass walls. "The former head of obstetrics nursing. She retired to Arizona 5 years ago. She assumed the Dane family would maintain her silence with a lifetime pension, but Lenora is notoriously cheap with her accomplices once the immediate danger has passed. The hush payment stopped 18 months ago. Marla was facing foreclosure on her condo. When my associates approached her yesterday with a draft of a federal indictment for medical fraud and kidnapping, her loyalty to your mother-in-law evaporated instantly." "What exactly did she give us on the record?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the photograph of the woman who had helped steal my life. "Everything," the lead litigator replied, sliding a thick, notarized affidavit across the smooth table. She confessed on tape. She stated that Lenora Dane personally cornered her in the sterile scrub room while you were heavily sedated. Lenora handed her a cashier check for $50,000 and gave the direct verbal order to cut the infant wristbands. Marla made the physical swap in the bassinet. Furthermore, she confirmed that Baxter Wynne was physically waiting in the hospital lobby with the falsified, pre-signed guardianship paperwork before the anesthesia even wore off your system. The mention of Baxter Wynne was a trigger, as if the universe sensed the tightening of the noose around his neck. My secure encrypted phone vibrated loudly against the glass table. The caller identification displayed the senior partner's private line. I held up a hand, demanding absolute silence from the room, and tapped the speaker button. simultaneously engaging the recording software. Athena, Baxter's voice slithered through the high-definition speaker, layered with a sickeningly paternal, condescending tone. Everett tells me you are digging into some ancient, sealed family matters regarding the estate. I strongly advise you to close those files and take a vacation. If you drag this absurd conspiracy theory into the light of a courtroom, the financial media will absolutely feast on it. The Galloway Marine Systems stock valuation will plummet by 30% overnight. Your grandfather's pristine legacy will be dragged through the mud. You will destroy your own corporate empire just to win a domestic dispute. I let his threat hang in the air for 5 seconds, ensuring the recording software captured the pristine, unedited audio of his blackmail attempt. Are you officially threatening the public valuation of my company to conceal a multi-generational felony? Baxter? I asked, my voice chillingly calm and perfectly modulated. He hesitated, the survival instinct of a seasoned lawyer kicking in a fraction of a second too late. I am simply warning you about severe market volatility. Athena. Internal family matters should always remain within the family structure. Your warning has been documented, I replied, and severed the connection. I looked directly at the lead litigator. Add corporate extortion and witness intimidation to his list of federal charges. I did not just want to expose the thieves to the police. I needed to permanently annihilate the financial prize that motivated the theft in the first place. The next morning, I bypassed Everett entirely and convened an emergency, closed-door session with the Independent Compliance Committee of the Galloway Board of Directors. I did not reveal the entire kidnapping plot to them, as that raw truth belongs solely to the criminal courts. Instead, I activated a heavily guarded, archaic emergency clause buried deep within the company bylaws. I filed a formal, binding injunction to immediately freeze the upcoming transfer of the proxy voting seat, citing credible, documented evidence of beneficiary origin fraud. The board members, terrified of impending federal oversight and Securities and Exchange Commission violations, complied immediately. The seat was locked. The grand prize was neutralized. Simultaneously, I executed a silent, impenetrable financial maneuver. I directed my private wealth manager to establish a blind, irrevocable educational trust. I funded it with $10 million, divided equally and unconditionally between Willa and Lucas. It was structured with such aggressive legal hostility that neither Everett, Lenora, nor any future court-appointed legal guardian could touch a single cent of the principal. Even when I detonated the explosive truth at the gala and the Dane family's assets were subsequently frozen by federal investigators, those two children would possess an absolute financial shield. I refused to let either child become collateral damage in a war waged over adult greed. Lucas was a victim of their toxic grooming, just as Willa was a victim of their theft. With the corporate and legal traps fully set and armed, I drove back to the coastal dampness of Port Townsend. Ruth Quinn met me at the door of her modest house, her face drawn but resolute. She had spent the evening reviewing the massive stack of legal immunity documents my team had drafted for her protection. "I will testify to everything under oath," Ruth said, her voice steady as we stood in her small, dimly lit kitchen. "I will hand over the extortion letters, the bank statements, the hidden ledgers. I will give them everything. But you have to promise me one specific thing. Athena, Willa does not become a media spectacle. You cannot parade her in front of the flashing cameras like a recovered trophy. She deserves her dignity and her privacy. I swear to you, Ruth," I promised, my voice fierce and uncompromising, "I am going to utterly destroy the adults who orchestrated this nightmare. I will break them in public. But I will not use her childhood as my stage." I thought the perimeter of our agreement was secure, but I had vastly underestimated the sheer, cold-forged steel of my own daughter's character. Willa stepped out from the narrow hallway, wearing her heavy canvas work jacket. She had been listening to the entire exchange. "I am going to the gala," Willa stated flatly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Both Ruth and I turned to her in absolute shock. "Willa, no," I started, stepping forward with my hand raised. "It is going to be an incredibly dangerous and chaotic environment. The press will be there." I do not want you exposed to that level of toxicity and panic. Willa did not back down an inch. Her gray-blue eyes locked onto mine, with an intensity that perfectly mirrored my own reflection when I stared down a hostile boardroom. I am not going there to cry, she said, her voice devoid of any childish fragility. I am not going there to hold your hand and act like a miraculously reunited, happy family for the newspapers. I want to stand in that room. I want to look directly at the people who stole my name and wrote over it on a piece of paper. They need to see exactly who they failed to erase. I looked at this fierce, unyielding 9-year-old girl. She was not asking for parental permission. She was informing me of her tactical position on the battlefield. A profound, world-shifting realization washed over me in that quiet kitchen. This final confrontation at the Founders' Tide Gala was no longer just about exposing Everett's infidelity to the truth or punishing Lenora's financial theft. This was going to be the moment I snapped the spine of an entire dynastic ideology. I was going to publicly break a toxic family culture that viewed women as mere incubators and children as disposable, interchangeable chess pieces on a grand board of inherited wealth. I nodded slowly, fully accepting her terms of engagement. You will stand on the private mezzanine, I instructed, my tone shifting from protective mother to commanding officer. Out of the direct crossfire. But you will be there. The trap was fully armed. The guests were preparing to arrive, and the tide was finally going to pull the entire Dane family under the surface. The Founders' Tide Gala was held at the meticulously restored Maritime Museum perched on the very edge of the city bay. It was a cavernous, breathtaking space constructed of dark, polished mahogany and gleaming brass, where the city elite gathered under the vaulted ceilings of a former shipwright warehouse. They paid tens of thousands of dollars a plate to dress up their hoarded, inherited wealth in the polite, philanthropic language of community conservation and maritime heritage. The air smelled of expensive floral perfumes, dry champagne, and the faint, lingering scent of ancient saltwater and treated cedar. I arrived after the cocktail hour had already begun. The string quartet was playing a bright, classical piece that soared over the ambient hum of 300 wealthy patrons. Waiters glided silently across the polished hardwood floors, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. I observed my husband before he noticed my presence. Everett stood near the center display, a massive antique compass binnacle salvaged from a 20th-century dreadnought. He wore a sharply tailored, midnight black tuxedo that draped perfectly over his shoulders. He was laughing at a joke made by a prominent city councilman, casually swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He wore his elegance like a flawless suit of armor, projecting the image of a titan of industry. He behaved exactly as if his forged signatures, his offshore wire transfers, and his calculated lies had never decimated a single human life. Then, my eyes found Camille. She was the vital, desperate link in their chain of fraud. She wore a shimmering silver gown, clinging nervously to the outer edge of Everett's influential social circle. I watched Everett introduce her to a pair of banking executives as Lucas's beloved, esteemed aunt. The sheer, suffocating irony of that introduction was a poison they all swallowed with smiles. Camille played her part, offering a tense, brittle laugh, but her hands trembled slightly as she held her clutch purse, her eyes darting constantly toward the exit doors. And then there was Lucas. He stood beside his grandmother near the front row of reserved tables. He wore a crisp, dark blue blazer, his hair perfectly parted and combed. But the arrogant, triumphant sneer that usually defined his features, the confident spark of a boy raised to own the world, was entirely extinguished. Stripped of his false mythology over the past week, deprived of his credit cards and his stolen title, he did not look like a little king preparing to ascend a corporate throne. He looked deeply terrified. He looked like a small, profoundly exhausted child who had been forcefully dragged into a high-stakes theatrical production directed by ruthless adults. Lenora Dane held court near the main stage stairs. She wore a heavy, antique emerald necklace that caught the stage lights, standing with the rigid, terrifying posture of the old queen of a dying dynasty. She did not mingle with the lower-tier donors. She was entirely focused on the wooden podium, radiating a desperate, coiled energy, preparing to forcefully cement her theft before my legal injunctions could bleed into the public record the following Monday. I finally stepped fully into the main hall. I did not enter flanked by a legal team, nor did I wear the forced, tight smile of a high society wife trying to manage a domestic scandal. I wore a floor-length, minimalist black dress with sharp, architectural lines. I wore absolutely no jewelry. I did not project the aura of a heartbroken woman whose marriage was a decade-long illusion. I walked through the glittering crowd with the absolute, freezing calm of a presiding judge carrying a signed, irreversible death warrant. The wealthy guests parted for me, offering polite nods and deferential greetings, completely blind to the fact that the polished floor beneath their designer shoes was wired with corporate explosives. I did not join my husband. I did not approach my mother-in-law. I took a solitary position near the back of the massive room, standing in the towering shadow of a suspended wooden schooner hull. I slowly lifted my gaze toward the ceiling. High above the glittering crowd, on a private, shadowed viewing mezzanine, stood Willa. She was flanked tightly by Ruth Quinn and my lead litigation attorney. The thick glass partition allowed her to witness the entire spectacle of her biological family without being torn apart by the suffocating press of the crowd below. She wore a simple cut, dark-woven sweater, her small hands resting flat against the glass railing. Her stormy gray-blue eyes were fixed downward, tracking every movement Everett and Lenora made. She was the ghost they thought they had successfully buried in a coastal town, standing quietly in the rafters, watching them dance on her stolen legacy. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. A sharp, clear chime echoed through the museum hall, signaling the start of the formal presentation. The crowd murmured, shifting their collective attention toward the front as the stage lights flared to a blinding white. Lenora Dane ascended the wooden steps to the podium, her head held unnaturally high. She grasped the edges of the heavy oak lectern, looking out over the sea of wealthy donors, politicians, and corporate board members. A large, ornate leather binder rested on the wood in front of her. Inside that binder was the symbolic document she intended to sign tonight, a public declaration officially recognizing Lucas as the generational successor of the Blue Current Foundation. It was a desperate, highly theatrical maneuver designed to bulldoze past my frozen transfer orders and legitimize his stolen seat before he officially turned 10 years old. "Friends, partners, and stewards of our shared legacy," Lenora began, her voice amplified and booming off the high wooden rafters. "We gather tonight not just to celebrate the glorious history of Galloway Marine Systems, but to secure its unyielding future." Every single syllable she spoke felt like a physical, violent strike against the truth standing silently on the mezzanine. "A legacy is not merely a transfer of capital," Lenora continued, her tone dripping with manufactured, pious reverence. "It is a transfer of blood. It is a sacred responsibility handed down through a continuous, unbroken lineage. It requires a steward who embodies the strength, the vision, and the inherent, natural character of the founders who built this empire from the salt water up." I watched Everett nod solemnly from his seat in the front row. I watched Camille stare firmly down at her lap, refusing to look at the stage. I watched Lucas shift his weight nervously from side to side, his eyes darting toward the back of the room where I stood. The boy knew the words were hollow. The boy knew the bloodline was a fabrication. Tonight, Lenora's voice rose, commanding the absolute, breathless attention of the 300 guests. "We take a vital, necessary step in ensuring that our unbroken chain remains eternally secure. The foundation requires a face for the next generation, a boy who has been raised within the walls of our proud tradition, who intimately understands the heavy crown of his inheritance." She gestured grandly toward the front row. "I ask my grandson, Lucas, to join me on this stage." A polite, rolling wave of applause began to swell through the enormous room. Everett stood up and placed a proud, firm hand on Lucas's shoulder, giving the boy a gentle push forward. Lucas stumbled slightly, his face ashen. but the momentum of the clapping crowd forced him to walk up the wooden steps. He stood next to the tall podium, looking infinitely small and fragile next to the towering, desperate ambition of his grandmother. Lenora opened the heavy leather binder with a dramatic flourish. She picked up a solid gold fountain pen, holding it up for the room to see. "With this signature," she announced, her voice trembling with the intoxicating thrill of her impending fraudulent victory, "we officially recognize Lucas as the future proxy of the Blue Current Foundation, securing our family's vision for the next 50 years. My litigation attorney, standing on the mezzanine above, caught my eye through the glass. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He had his hand on his phone, waiting for my exact signal to unleash the prepared legal packets to the financial press waiting in the lobby, and to signal the financial investigators parked down the street. But I did not raise my hand. I did not shout from the back of the room. I did not rush the stage to interrupt her triumphant monologue. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the Maritime Museum, my breathing slow and steady. I let her savor the absolute peak of the illusion. I let the room reach its most complacent, self-congratulatory zenith. I let the applause grow louder, washing over the smiling grandmother and the terrified, stolen boy. In the cold, unforgiving calculus of corporate and personal destruction, I understood one fundamental truth. There is absolutely no beauty in stopping a lie while it is still hiding in the dark. The true art, the only way to permanently shatter a dynasty built on deception, is to let the lie stand up in the brightest spotlight, let it raise its hands to accept the thundering applause of its peers, and then violently break its knees in front of everyone it ever wanted to impress. Lenora held the gold fountain pen aloft, the stage lights catching its polished surface. The applause rippled through the Maritime Museum, a polite and ignorant wave of validation. She turned the heavy leather binder toward the boy standing beside her. I stood up. The sound of my chair sliding back against the hardwood floor was sharp enough to slice through the fading applause. I did not raise my hand like a student asking for permission. I stepped out from the shadow of the suspended wooden hull and walked directly down the center aisle. Before any ink touches that legally binding document, I projected my voice, letting it carry the absolute authority of the controlling shareholder and current founder of the Galloway estate. I am exercising my right to address this assembly. A murmur of confusion swept through the room. Several board members smiled indulgently, adjusting their tuxedo jackets. They assumed this was a planned part of the ceremony. They expected a proud mother to offer a polite, face-saving speech about family values and shared futures. Lenora tightened her grip on the pen, her eyes narrowing into cold slits of warning. Everett shifted his weight uneasily in the front row. I did not offer a speech of gratitude. Instead, I stopped at the edge of the stage and raised my right hand. From the perimeter doors, my legal team moved with the synchronized precision of a military strike. Malcolm Sayer and 4 senior litigators walked briskly down the aisles. They carried thick, sealed manila envelopes. Without a word, they began dropping these envelopes directly into the laps of the trust board members, the major philanthropic donors, and a select group of financial journalists I had quietly cleared through security an hour earlier. "What is the meaning of this?" Lenora demanded, abandoning the microphone, her voice hissing like a cornered viper. I ignored her entirely. I turned to face the bewildered crowd. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, a federal judge granted an emergency injunction temporarily freezing all transfers, proxies, and voting rights associated with the Firstborn Son Clause of the Blue Current Foundation. The room erupted in a chaotic chorus of gasps and muttered questions. The head of the foundation board stood up, holding his unopened envelope. "On what grounds?" he asked loudly. "On the grounds of beneficiary origin fraud," I answered, my voice cutting through the noise like a steel blade. I pointed a single, steady finger at the boy standing on the stage. "Because the child presented to you tonight as the symbol of this dynasty is not my biological son." I did not rely on emotional hysterics. I did not project dramatic videos onto the museum walls or scream about my broken heart. I read the facts with the lethal, clipped efficiency of an auditor presenting a terminal bankruptcy. Inside your envelopes, you will find the verified architecture of a 9-year criminal conspiracy, I stated, locking eyes with the front row. You will find the sworn testimony of the attending obstetrician confirming I delivered a premature female infant. You will find the certified DNA analysis confirming a 99.9% match with my actual daughter. You will find the notarized, recorded confession of the former head nurse, Marla Pike, admitting she accepted a bribe from Lenora Dane to swap the newborn wristbands in the surgical recovery ward. You will find the sealed guardianship documents drafted by our own family attorney, Baxter Wynne, designed to hide the stolen infant. And finally, you will find the wire transfer ledgers from the Dane family office, proving they funded the absolute erasure of my child's existence. The silence that fell over the cavernous hall was total and suffocating. The wealthy elite stopped breathing. They held the papers in their hands as if the pages were soaked in poison. Everett finally broke. He leaped from his seat. His face flushed a dark, violent crimson. He pointed at me, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Do not listen to her. She is having a psychotic break. The stress of the corporate merger has completely destroyed her mind. Call security and have her removed immediately." He tried to rally the room with loud, desperate outrage. He tried to paint me as the hysterical, overworked woman, but he forgot to secure his weakest flank. Camille stood up from the second row. The silver gown she wore suddenly looked like a heavy chain dragging her to the floor. She had read the summary page of the indictment included in the envelopes. She saw the federal charges of kidnapping, wire fraud, and extortion, the immense, crushing pressure of the crowd, the lawyers, and her own crippling guilt finally shattered her. She collapsed to her knees, right in the middle of the aisle. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, a loud, ugly, echoing sound that destroyed Everett's defense instantly. "I am sorry," Camille wailed, her voice echoing off the brass binnacles and wooden beams. "I am so sorry. I was completely bankrupt. I was going to lose everything." Mother and Everett promised they would clear my $2 million debt and keep our family in power if I just let my son go to your house. They said he would have a better life. They said your baby was just an obstacle. Everett froze, his hands still suspended in the air. The undeniable confession of his own sister hung over the room, a heavy, suffocating shroud. Lenora Dane, however, did not collapse. The old queen refused to surrender her crown, even as the kingdom burned around her. She stepped up to the microphone, her face pale but her posture terrifyingly rigid. She looked out at the horrified faces of her peers and attempted to justify the unjustifiable. "This was a logical family solution," Lenora announced, her voice echoing with a sickening, self-righteous conviction. "Our world requires structure. It requires a male heir to project strength and stability to the markets. If the voting proxy fell to a female child, the Galloway shares would eventually be diluted by outside marriages. We protected the legacy. We kept the power where it belongs. I did what was necessary to ensure this empire did not fall into the hands of outsiders." The entire room recoiled. It was one thing to suspect the ruthless nature of the ultra-wealthy. It was entirely different to hear a grandmother publicly defend the theft and trade of 2 human infants as a simple corporate restructuring maneuver. The naked, unapologetic cruelty of her logic left 300 people in stunned, breathless horror. But the final blow did not come from me, nor did it come from my legal team. It came from the pawn they had placed on the board. Lucas had been standing frozen near the podium, his face ashen, his small hands trembling violently against the fabric of his dark blazer. The boy had been raised on a diet of supremacy and entitlement, but the absolute ugliness of his grandmother's words finally broke the spell. He realized he was not a king. He was a purchased commodity. Lucas stepped forward. He grabbed the microphone stand, pulling it away from Lenora. His voice was shaking, but his mind was more awake than anyone in that room had ever given him credit for. "It is true," Lucas said, his young voice echoing through the massive hall. He turned to look directly at the board members. "Grandmother told me the rules a long time ago. She always told me, "You are the borrowed child put in the right cradle." I thought it meant I was special, but it just meant I was a fake. That single sentence severed every remaining escape route. The illusion was dead. The architects of the lie were entirely exposed by the very tool they had built. A sudden movement drew the collective gaze of the room upward. The heavy velvet curtains on the private mezzanine parted. Willa stepped forward until she stood flush against the glass railing. The spotlight caught her dark hair and her calm, storm-gray eyes. She did not look like a frightened child. She did not cry, and she did not seek a comforting embrace from the adults standing behind her. She stood perfectly still, looking straight down from the rafters at Lenora and Everett. Her quiet, unwavering presence was the most damning evidence of all. Looking at her face, the fierce, analytical set of her jaw, the sharp, intelligent eyes, the entire room instantly recognized my reflection. They understood, with a collective, silent gasp, that this had never been a tragic hospital mistake. This was a calculated, organized robbery of a human life. Everett looked up at the mezzanine. His pristine armor shattered completely. He saw the daughter he had thrown away and the son who had just publicly rejected him. Desperation, wild and feral, finally overtook him. He lunged forward toward the edge of the stage, reaching his hands out in a pathetic, simultaneous gesture toward the rafters and the boy beside him. "Lucas, wait, please," Everett begged, his voice cracking. "Willa, I can explain everything. I am your father. We can fix this." Lucas took a sharp step backward, physically avoiding his father's outstretched hand as if it were burning iron. He refused the touch. High above the chaos, Willa leaned forward slightly against the glass. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The sheer, freezing gravity of her words carried down to the stage with devastating clarity. "You did not lose me tonight," Willa said, her voice a short, cold strike of absolute finality. "You lost yourself 9 years ago." The gold fountain pen slipped from Lenora's fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards, the only sound left in a room that had just witnessed the total, undeniable collapse of the Dane dynasty. The clatter of the gold fountain pen against the hardwood floor acted as a starting gun. Before the echo could even fade into the vaulted ceiling of the Maritime Museum, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the Grand Hall swung violently open. A joint task force comprised of special financial investigators and uniformed federal officers marched in, their presence instantly shattering the fragile aristocratic atmosphere. They did not pause to respect the wealth in the room. They moved with surgical precision, bypassing the stunned philanthropic donors and heading directly for the stage in the front row. Warrants were produced with lethal efficiency. I stood in the shadows and watched the absolute dismantling of the Dane family infrastructure unfold in real time. Investigators seized Everett's encrypted phone directly from his trembling hands, locking his digital access before he could even attempt a remote wipe of his servers. Baxter Wynne, the architect of the Shadow Guardianship, tried to slip out through the kitchen corridors, but was intercepted by 2 detectives. He attempted to loudly cite attorney and client privilege, but his protests were abruptly silenced when they presented the warrant for witness extortion and corporate blackmail. He was escorted out through the service elevator, his designer briefcase confiscated as primary evidence. Lenora Dane did not scream or fight. As the officers approached the stage to escort her to the precinct for a midnight interrogation, she maintained her rigid, terrifying posture, but the illusion of the untouchable matriarch was entirely dead. She was just an old, desperate woman whose theft had finally caught up to her. Camille, however, spared the officers the trouble of a pursuit. She immediately broke away from her social circle, approached the lead investigator, and unconditionally accepted a plea agreement on the spot. She offered to hand over every single piece of correspondence, every hidden ledger, and every sealed document in exchange for leniency, entirely selling out her mother and brother to save herself from a maximum prison sentence. By sunrise, Everett was locked out of every corporate account, stripped of all representative powers, and legally barred from the Galloway Marine Systems headquarters. The empire he tried to steal had locked its gates permanently against him. The following morning, I convened a mandatory, unsparing session with the entire executive board. The room was thick with terror, the executives acutely aware that the federal spotlight was now aimed at our foundation. I did not give them a moment to panic or attempt to distance themselves. I took the head seat and systematically amputated the infection. I presented a binding legal directive, heavily reinforced by my controlling shares, and personally eradicated the archaic firstborn son clause from the future structure of the Blue Current Foundation. I permanently dismantled the mechanism that had made a male heir a requirement for power. I turned the grand, terrifying motive behind a 9-year kidnapping into a completely worthless pile of shredded paper. Before they could even process the corporate restructure, I executed my final financial maneuver. I publicly ratified the equal, blind educational trusts I had established for both Willa and Lucas. I looked the board members in the eye and declared that no one in the Dane family, and no one sitting at this table, would ever again be permitted to use corporate capital as a leash to strangle a child. The money was locked, untouchable by the adults who had proven themselves monstrous. The legal shockwaves consumed the city for weeks, but the true resolution of this war did not take place in a courtroom or on the front pages of the financial journals. The hardest battles were fought in the quiet spaces left behind by the explosion. 2 weeks after the gala, I sat in my private library with Lucas. The house was empty, stripped of the toxic influence of his father and grandmother. He looked incredibly small sitting on the heavy leather sofa, a boy who had been trained to rule an empire but was currently just trying to survive the collapse of his entire reality. I did not pour the sins of the adults onto his shoulders. I offered him the first genuine, unmanipulated choice of his entire life. I told him he could remain in my house. I outlined the strict parameters: intensive behavioral therapy, firm boundaries, community labor, and absolute adherence to the truth. Or, I explained, once the federal indictments were settled and the courts established a safe framework, he could choose to transition his life and live with Camille. I watched him process the weight of his own autonomy. He did not immediately choose the lingering comfort of the mansion, nor did he default to the easy arrogance he had worn for years. He looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper, and asked for only one thing. He asked if I would arrange a meeting with Willa so he could look her in the eye and apologize for everything he had said and done. He added, with a heartbreaking clarity, that he fully understood if she refused to see him. In that quiet, vulnerable request, the arrogant little prince completely vanished. I realized that, stripped of the lies and the grooming, the boy sitting across from me was finally beginning the agonizing work of becoming a decent human being, rather than a ruthless inheritance project. As for Willa, she remained an unbreakable force of nature. She did not immediately pack her bags and move into the Seattle estate. She held her ground, honoring her promise to Ruth Quinn and maintaining the fierce independence she had forged by the ocean. She continued her education at her local school and slept in her bedroom overlooking the bay. But she allowed the ice to thaw, precisely on her own terms. She agreed to let me enter her life on a regular schedule, no longer hiding behind the mask of a corporate philanthropy sponsor, but standing before her as a mother attempting to learn the language of her child from absolute zero. 3 months after the tide rushed back in and exposed the ocean floor, I found myself standing in the drafty, freezing community workshop in Port Townsend. The smell of rusted iron, damp cedar, and marine oil was thick and comforting in the air. Willa was lying flat on a wooden mechanic creeper, her upper body completely swallowed by the heavy, complicated steel block of a salvaged inboard engine. I stood beside the rusted hull, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket over my sweater. I was holding a heavy brass flashlight, aiming the beam into the dark cavity of the machinery. My hands clumsy and unpracticed in this environment. Willa reached her grease-stained hand out from under the engine block, blindly searching the air. I anticipated the movement, picking up the heavy crescent wrench and placing it firmly into her palm. She adjusted her grip, the sound of grinding metal echoing sharply against the wooden walls as she fought a rusted bolt. She did not call me Mom. She did not offer a tearful embrace or a cinematic declaration of forgiveness. She simply shifted her weight under the heavy iron, her voice calm and focused. Athena, hold the light a little higher. Together. The cold coastal wind rattled the warehouse windows, but I stood perfectly, wonderfully still. I adjusted the beam of light exactly as she instructed. For me, hearing that single word, together, was a victory infinitely more precious than any courtroom verdict, any public apology, or any corporate empire I had ever fought to keep. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.